Hey guys, welcome back to Oops in History. Tonight, we're diving into something a little wild, a little dangerous, and honestly, kind of hilarious when you think about it. We're talking about the craziest one-on-one fights in medieval history. Forget about massive armies clashing on muddy fields. Forget about castles being sieged for weeks on end. Sometimes the real drama, the real legendary stuff, happened when just two people faced off. Think of it like medieval UFC, except with more chainmail, questionable hygiene, and a much higher chance of somebody losing a limb. Now, before you drift off into sleep, let me set the tone. Picture it, a quiet clearing, a bunch of nobles and peasants gathered around to watch. The air filled with the smell of horses, and maybe some roasted meat from vendors trying to cash in on the spectacle. And right in the center, two figures squaring off, each convinced destiny was on their side. Sometimes it was honor, sometimes it was politics, and sometimes, believe it or not, it was just over a petty insult. Like your pig wandered into my field, or you insulted my mustache. One of the first stories that really sets the mood comes from 11th century France. Imagine this, a noble named Guy of Laval, facing off against another knight in what was basically a medieval grudge match. These weren't casual squabbles. People would stake land, wealth, even their reputations. If you lost, you didn't just lose face, you might lose your castle, your family's fortune, or your life. Guy, being a hot-headed noble, decided that the best way to settle a legal dispute wasn't in court, but with swords. Classic medieval logic. Why argue when you can hit each other with sharpened steel? And oh, these duels weren't always fought fairly. Armor could be mismatched, weapons could be chosen to give one fighter an advantage, and there were always whispers of sabotage. But to the crowd, it was the ultimate entertainment. You have to remember, this was before Netflix. Watching two heavily armored men whack each other until one surrendered or died was basically peak weekend fun. Then there's the legendary tale of Jean de Carouge and Jacques Le Gris, the so-called last judicial duel in France, 1386. This one was so epic, it became the stuff of legends and even made its way into modern film. Jean accused Jacques of assaulting his wife, and instead of just going through the court system, they ended up fighting in front of King Charles VI himself. Imagine the pressure. The whole kingdom watching, royalty sitting in the stands, everyone whispering about who they believed. Jean in full armor, his wife praying desperately on the sidelines, Jacques probably sweating under his helmet. When swords clashed, it wasn't just about personal honor, it was about justice, or at least their version of it. Jean ended up victorious, but the story is soaked with drama, politics, and a chilling reminder that medieval justice was as brutal as it gets. But not all medieval 1v1 fights were about honor. Some were straight up bizarre. Like, did you know that in parts of the Holy Roman Empire, men and women could actually fight each other in trial by combat? Yup, you heard me right. If a woman accused a man of some serious crime, sometimes the solution was to put them both in a ring. To keep it fair, the man would have one arm tied behind his back and be forced to fight from a waist-deep pit, while the woman had the freedom to move around and wield a weighted sack filled with stones. Picture that an angry medieval woman swinging a bag of rocks at some guy stuck in a hole. Honestly, if Netflix adapted that, people would binge it like crazy. Now, if you're still awake, think about this. Every duel, no matter how small or ridiculous, carried insane consequences. Nobles could lose titles, knights could lose everything they owned, peasants could find themselves suddenly elevated or ruined based on who came out alive. And yet, people lined up to fight. It wasn't just about survival, it was about pride, reputation, and the strange medieval idea that God himself would step in to make sure the right person won. Spoiler, it didn't always work out that way. So as you relax and let your eyelids get heavy, just imagine those medieval duelists standing in the dirt, weapons in hand, hearts racing, convinced that fate, destiny, and maybe a bit of divine intervention were all on their side. Take the case of the duel between Sir Robert de Morley and a rival knight in 14th century England. This wasn't a simple backyard brawl. These guys showed up in full plate armor, mounted on horses, with banners waving like it was a festival. Everyone was there to watch, lords, ladies, probably some pickpockets sneaking through the crowd too. What made it special was the fact that these knights weren't even fighting for themselves. They were fighting because someone insulted their lord's honor. Imagine being so loyal that you're ready to get chopped in half just because your boss couldn't let go of a rude comment. That's medieval workplace drama at its peak. Then, there's the Duel of Hal of Hadley. He was a commoner, not some shining knight. But medieval times had this funny way of saying, you're guilty until proven innocent. And by innocent, we mean, win a fight. Poor Hal got accused of theft, and his fate was sealed in trial by combat. They gave him a club and threw him against someone much bigger. But here's the twist. Hal somehow managed to win. Picture the underdogs, crappy, sweaty, probably terrified, swinging wildly until his opponent went down. The crowd must have lost their minds. It was the medieval version of a Rocky movie. Now, let's move east for a second. In Poland, there was a duel recorded between a knight named Zawisza, the Black, and an opponent who underestimated him. Zawisza was this legendary guy, chivalrous, strong, and almost annoyingly unbeatable. People said he never lost a duel, not once. He was the type of fighter that made everyone else rethink their career choices. His most famous 1v1 fights weren't even about disputes, they were tournament challenges, where he'd face knights from across Europe. And each time, he walked away victorious. If medieval history had trading cards, Zawisza would have been the rare shiny one everyone wanted. Of course, some duels leaned more toward the bizarre side of things. In medieval Germany, there's an account of a husband and wife duel where, instead of fighting with regular weapons, they had to use farm tools. The man got a wooden club, the woman got a rock in a sack, and both had to settle a household dispute this way. Imagine the crowd watching while a married couple hashed out their issues in front of everyone. Marriage counseling, medieval edition. Honestly, part of me thinks this was less about justice and more about giving the neighbors some juicy drama to talk about. Another fascinating story comes from Italy, where duels were almost ritualistic. They weren't always to the death. Sometimes it was enough to draw first blood or force your opponent to yield. But even then, the spectacle was everything. People would bet money, cheer for their favorite knight, and spread gossip afterward. One duel in Milan turned into a citywide event, with banners, trumpets, and processions leading up to the fight. Two men fought over a supposed insult, but in reality, it was more about proving who was the better man in front of everyone who mattered. Imagine the pressure: one wrong move, and not only do you lose the duel, but you also become the butt of every tavern joke for the next decade. And then, of course, there were duels where both fighters lost. Yep, it happened. Sometimes they'd both land fatal blows, or collapse from exhaustion in their heavy armor. Nothing quite says oops in history like two people fighting to prove a point, and ending up proving nothing at all. The crowd would shuffle home, probably grumbling that it wasn't worth skipping dinner for. So as you're drifting off, think about this. In a world without internet, TV, or boxing matches, these duels were prime entertainment. People risked their lives, their fortunes, and sometimes their marriages, just for the chance to fight one-on-one. It was brutal, unfair, sometimes ridiculous, but it was also unforgettable. One of the most spine-chilling duels took place in Scotland. William Wallace, yes, the same one you might remember from the Legends, was said to have faced off in single combat during his rise against English forces. While much of his life has been wrapped in myth, what stands out is how personal those fights felt. Imagine two men, one representing rebellion, the other defending authority, clashing in the mud before armies even lifted their spears. In the quiet moments before they struck, the weight of Scotland's freedom may as well have hung in the air. Whether embellished or not, the idea of Wallace in a 1v1 was enough to light fires in the hearts of rebels everywhere. Now, shift south to Spain, where knights often settled disputes, not with lengthy lawsuits, but by crossing blades in the dust. One record speaks of Diego Garcia de Paredes, nicknamed the Samson of Extremadura. This man wasn't just a knight, he was practically a one-man army. In his youth, he took part in duels where his opponents underestimated him, thinking his strength was just exaggerated tavern talk. But he proved them wrong by flattening challenger after challenger, often in front of noble courts. His sheer size and skill turned every fight into a half-legendary story. If you can imagine a medieval wrestler with a broadsword, that was Diego. Crowds adored him, and his rivals feared him. Then, there's the infamous duel in Hungary between two nobles, Laszlo and Miklos, who quarreled over, get this, a dog. Yes, a dog. In their minds, the animal symbolized property, pride, and insult, all rolled into one furry package. They could have argued in court, but nope, they strapped on armor and faced each other in a field. The fight dragged on for hours, both exhausted, both refusing to yield. In the end, one collapsed, while the other barely managed to stay standing. All over a dog. If there was ever proof that medieval logic was a bit questionable, this was it. Meanwhile, in France, tournaments often blurred the line between sport and actual combat. Knights would enter lists, joust, and sometimes grudges carried into one-on-one duels afterward. Geoffroy de Charny, a knight known for his chivalric ideals, often spoke about the honor of single combat. He believed that fighting man-to-man was the truest test of bravery, not the chaos of the battlefield. One tale tells of him defending his king's honor in a duel that had nobles whispering for months afterward. Imagine how much weight his every strike carried, because in their world, a knight wasn't just fighting for himself, but for the crown, for his family name, and for how history would remember him. But duels weren't always armored slugfests. Sometimes, they were shockingly intimate. In Italian city-states, there are accounts of duels fought with daggers, in narrow alleys or private courtyards, while only a few witnesses looked on. These weren't meant for the spectacle of crowds, they were deadly personal. Picture the flickering torchlight, the silence broken only by quick breaths, and the clash of steel barely more than whispers. One wrong move, and it was over. These dagger duels might not have drawn crowds, but they carved unforgettable stories into the walls of history. And then you have the story of the legendary knight Bayard, the knight without fear and without reproach. In a duel during his campaigns, Bayard's composure under pressure stunned everyone. He fought calmly, almost gracefully, even as blades cut the air around him. His opponents walked away either defeated or humbled, realizing they were fighting not just a man, but an ideal. Bayard's reputation alone was enough to disarm many before the duel even began. So as you drift deeper into this medieval dreamscape, imagine the variety of these clashes. Some were loud, cheered on by crowds in fields or castles. Others were quiet, whispered about in the shadows of alleyways. Some were noble, others petty, and many were just plain bizarre. But in each of them, two people believed the outcome would define them forever. One of the most bizarre duels comes from the Holy Roman Empire in the 15th century. There was a knight named Hans Talhofer, who wasn't just a fighter, but also a dueling master. He even wrote manuals showing how to fight with swords, axes, and, weirdly enough, farm tools. In one of his illustrated guides, he depicts a man and woman dueling, yes, that same Pitan's Cuffstones fight I mentioned earlier. The image is hilarious by modern standards, but it's also deadly serious. It was proof that medieval society really did allow almost any kind of one-on-one fight to settle disputes. Imagine flipping through a dusty old book and seeing step-by-step instructions for how to clobber your husband with a rock in a sack. That's medieval DIY for you. Then there's the story of Bertrand du Guesclin, a French knight who lived in the 14th century. He wasn't handsome, he wasn't from the fanciest noble family, and people often mocked him for his looks. But Bertrand had something better. An unmatched ferocity in one-on-one combat. One famous tale says that when challenged by a sneering rival, Bertrand simply gritted his teeth, swung his sword with raw fury, and floored his opponent before the crowd even had time to cheer. His duels became legendary because they proved a point courage and determination could make even the unlikeliest man into a hero. And in a world obsessed with appearance, Bertrand's victories gave hope to anyone who wasn't exactly knight in shining armor material. Meanwhile, in England, you had duels that were tied tightly to politics. Imagine two nobles, circling each other not just for personal honor, but because one of them represented a political faction trying to dominate the king's court. The stakes weren't just life and death, they were entire policies, land rights, and royal favor. One of the most famous was the trial by combat between Henry Bolingbroke, who later became King Henry IV, and Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, in 1398. They accused each other of treason, and the stage was set for a monumental clash. Crowds filled the lists, banners fluttered, and the king himself was there to watch. Both men, armored to the teeth, prepared to fight for everything. But at the last moment, King Richard II stopped the duel and banished them both instead. Imagine the frustration in that crowd, waiting all day for the fight of the century, only to watch it end before the first sword swing. Medieval anticlimax at its finest. Over in Eastern Europe, the legendary Lithuanian Duke Vytautas is remembered not only for his wars, but also for stories of personal combat. Chronicles suggest that before leading armies, he sometimes challenged enemy champions one-on-one to boost his men's morale. It wasn't unusual for leaders to show their strength in this way, proving they could fight just as fiercely as their soldiers. These duels weren't just personal, they were symbolic. When Vytautas strode onto a field, sword in hand, he wasn't just one man, he was Lithuania itself, daring anyone to try and bring him down. And let's not forget the duels fought in the name of romance. Knights loved to prove their devotion by challenging rivals, or even complete strangers in their lady's honor. One Spanish knight, for example, fought a duel over a poetic insult. His rival had mocked his verses, saying his lady wasn't worthy of such praise. Instead of shrugging it off, he called the man out. The fight became a clash of swords and sonnets, steel and pride. It's absurd to us now, but back then, poetry was serious business and an insulted knight was a dangerous thing. As you drift deeper into the story, think about the range of emotions packed into these duels. Pride, rage, love, politics, faith. Sometimes the duels ended with a clean victory, sometimes with both men collapsed in exhaustion, and sometimes with the crown stepping in to say, "All right, that's enough." But no matter what, each duel became a tale that lived on in whispers, tavern songs, and chronicles. One of the most outrageous duels took place in Burgundy in the 15th century, involving two knights who couldn't let go of their pride. One of them, Pierre de Breze, was known for his hot temper and love of attention. He challenged his rival in front of an audience that included nobles, clergy, and even a few merchants who probably just wanted a good story to tell later at the tavern. The fight was brutal, armor clanging, swords flashing, but what made it memorable wasn't who won. It was the sheer stubbornness. Neither man wanted to admit defeat, even when they were both bleeding and wobbling like drunks after a festival. Eventually, the crowd had to step in to separate them. Nobody declared victory, but both strutted away, claiming they had won. Classic medieval logic. If you don't admit to losing, then technically you didn't. Then you have stories that lean more toward comedy than valor. In Germany, there's a tale of two merchants who got into such a vicious argument about money that they demanded a duel. Here's the problem, they weren't knights. They didn't have shining armor, war horses, or even much experience with weapons. So, they grabbed what they could, cudgels and kitchen knives. The duel ended up looking more like two angry drunks fighting behind a bakery than an epic knightly showdown. One fell into a pile of mud, the other lost his shoe, and eventually the authorities broke it up. Did it solve anything? Probably not. But you can bet the local crowd laughed about it for weeks. Now, let's talk about the famous Scottish warrior Black Agnes. She was mostly remembered for defending castles, but there's one record of her accepting a duel against a rival who doubted her strength. Instead of shying away, she showed up fully armored, wielding a mace, and gave her challenger such a thrashing that he limped for days. People weren't just shocked, they were inspired. Imagine the gossip. Did you hear about Lady Agnes? She beat a man senseless in single combat. In a time when women were rarely allowed on the battlefield, this was legendary. She didn't just defend her honor, she proved that the battlefield wasn't just for men. And of course, there were duels that became legendary precisely because of their ridiculous stakes. In one English village, two men fought to the death over who had the right to fish in a certain pond. Imagine it, swords flashing, neighbors watching, all for a couple of carp. By the end, one man was dead, the other was limping, and the pond probably didn't care who won. If that isn't the most medieval thing ever, I don't know what is. But sometimes, these duels could change history itself. Consider Richard Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick. During his travels in Europe, he entered duels against foreign knights, not just to prove his strength, but to show that English chivalry was second to none. His victories gave him such a reputation that foreign courts treated him like royalty. Imagine that, winning duels so convincingly that you boost your entire country's prestige abroad. That's more than just personal pride, that's medieval diplomacy, fought with swords instead of pens. And yet, for every noble duel with banners and honor, there were messy ones behind taverns, or between angry neighbors, or even inside city walls. The medieval world loved the idea of settling things man to man, whether it was noble knights in gleaming armor, scrappy villagers with clubs, or even married couples with sacks of stones. The one thing they all had in common was this unshakable belief: a fight could solve what words could not. So as you drift further into the night, imagine the clang of steel echoing through the ages, the crowd's roar fading into silence, and two stubborn souls convinced the entire universe depended on who stayed standing. One of the wildest duels tied to royalty comes from Castile in the 14th century. Pedro the Cruelest, that was his nickname. Not exactly a flattering one, was a king who didn't shy away from personal combat. In 1359, he fought his own half-brother, Henry, in a vicious one-on-one battle for the throne. Imagine that, two royal brothers, swords clashing, each convinced that they were the rightful king. Eyewitnesses said the fight was raw, messy, and horrifying, because this wasn't just about honor, it was about ruling an entire kingdom. Pedro fought fiercely, but Henry ultimately killed him with a dagger, seizing the crown for himself. It was like a medieval family feud, except the prize wasn't just bragging rights, it was a throne. Over in England, you've got the legendary duel between Henry Percybetter, known as Hotspur, and Douglas, a Scottish knight. These two men embodied the endless Anglo-Scottish rivalry, and their clash at the Battle of Otterburn in 1388 turned into something close to a private duel in the middle of a larger fight. Picture knights and soldiers clashing all around, yet in the chaos, Percy and Douglas found each other. Their fight was fierce, steel against steel, both men too stubborn to back down. Douglas was mortally wounded, but his legend grew even larger after his death, while Percy walked away scarred and remembered as one of the most fiery knights of his age. Meanwhile, in the German lands, you had champion duels, where two fighters would step forward to represent their lords or cities. One famous account speaks of a duel between a knight from Nuremberg and one from Augsburg. The two men fought in front of a massive crowd, with banners flying and trumpets sounding. Because the outcome wasn't just personal, it represented civic pride. When the knight from Nuremberg won, the city's prestige soared. Imagine a whole town throwing a party because our guy beat their guy in a sword fight. It was medieval sports fandom at its finest. Not all duels were fought with swords, though. In some Scandinavian traditions, axes were the weapon of choice. One saga tells of a Viking-descended warrior challenging another man to single combat on a small island, with rules that no one could step off the rock during the fight. Picture two men locked in combat, surrounded by icy water, each swing of the axe deciding not just the outcome, but their very survival. One slip, one wrong step, and it wasn't just the axe you had to worry about, it was drowning in the freezing water below. These fights blurred the line between duel and survival challenge, and people remembered them for generations. And then, sometimes, duels had an almost theatrical flair. A French knight once insisted on fighting an Italian rival, not in armor, but dressed in fine silk, because he wanted to prove that skill, not protection, was what mattered. He strode onto the field, looking like he belonged at a banquet, not a battlefield. It sounds ridiculous, but he actually won. His rival was humiliated, and the story spread like wildfire. The knight in silk defeated the knight in steel. It was half bravery, half arrogance, but fully unforgettable. As the night deepens and you let yourself drift, imagine these fighters. Some fought for crowns, some for cities, some for personal pride, and some just for the sheer drama of it all. The clang of weapons, the roar of crowds, the silence when one man fell out, was all part of the strange, dangerous theater of medieval one-on-one combat. Take the famous duel between Jarnac and La Châtaigneraie in 1547 France. Now, this wasn't strictly medieval, it was the tail end of the Middle Ages rolling into the Renaissance, but it carried the same spirit. The two men accused each other of dishonorable behavior, and the insulted parties demanded satisfaction. King Henry II himself allowed the duel, making it one of the last officially sanctioned judicial combats in France. Everyone gathered to watch, almost like it was the Super Bowl of sword fights. And here's the twist: Jarnac, the underdog, pulled off a surprise move nobody expected. He sliced his opponent behind the knee, crippling him. That one strike became so legendary that people in France started using the phrase coup de Jarnac to mean an unexpected, clever blow. From a single duel, a whole expression was born. And sometimes, the duels weren't about proving honor, but saving face. A knight might accuse another of lying, cheating, or worse, cowardice. In a society where reputation was everything, words could cut deeper than swords. One 14th century knight recorded how his opponent called him a dog unworthy of knighthood. Instead of trading insults back and forth, the solution was simple. They met in single combat with lances, shields, and swords, until one of them couldn't stand. And here's the kicker: crowds came to watch like it was a public holiday. Merchants sold food, minstrels sang songs, and nobles placed wagers. A duel wasn't just justice, it was entertainment. Of course, medieval people had a flair for the dramatic. There are accounts of knights riding into duels in full golden armor, their horses draped in silk, looking more like parade floats than fighters. Others chose bizarre weapons. There's one story of a German duel fought with maces instead of swordstick, brutal clubs designed to shatter bone. Imagine two men bashing away at each other under the summer sun, armor denting and shields cracking, while the crowd roared every time one of them landed a blow. It sounds more like a gladiator match than a court of law. And let's not forget those love duels. That sounded like something out of a rom-com gone terribly wrong. Two knights might duel because they both claimed to be the favorite of the same noblewoman. She, of course, got the best seat in the house, watching while armored men risked their lives to prove who loved her more. Did she actually care? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But for the knights, winning meant eternal bragging rights in the halls of chivalry. What makes these duels so fascinating is that they blurred the line between justice, sport, and theater. The outcome didn't just change to lives, it could shape reputations, spark rumors, and even influence politics. People remembered not just who won, but how they won. Was it by brute force, clever trick, or sheer luck? As you relax deeper into this story, imagine the flicker of torches, the hush of the crowd, the nervous heartbeat of a knight stepping forward, knowing one wrong move could cost him everything. Some fought for justice, some for pride, some for love, but all of them left behind tales that still echo through history. One of the most bizarre types of one-on-one fights in medieval Europe was the trial by combat. This wasn't just about two hot-headed knights showing off. It was literally a court-approved way to decide guilt or innocence. If you were accused of a crime and thought the judge was biased or the evidence shaky, you could demand a duel. The belief was simple: God would protect the innocent. Sounds noble, right? But in practice, it could get very weird. Take Germany in the 14th century. A man accused of murder agreed to a trial by combat, but because he wasn't a knight and didn't have the money for armor, both he and his opponent fought nearly naked, smeared in oil, and armed with clubs. Picture that for a second. A legal proceeding that looked more like a wrestling match in some back-alley tavern than a solemn trial. The crowd loved it. Of course, nothing entertained medieval folks more than watching two half-naked men club each other into submission to prove who God thought was right. And then there were the animal duels. Believe it or not, there are scattered accounts of men being forced to fight dogs in judicial duels. Sometimes the accused man had to go against a trained mastiff, the dog representing divine judgment. Imagine standing in a dusty arena, heart racing, as a snarling beast lunged at you, while a crowd of nobles calmly sipped their wine and said, "Yes, justice is being served." If you won, you walked away innocent. If you lost, well, let's just say no appeal process was available. But even the regular nightly duels could spiral into the surreal. One famous 15th century German combat manual shows instructions for a husband and wife duel. Yes, you read that right. If a husband accused his wife of a serious crime, they could be made to fight each other in an official duel. To make it fair, the man had to stand waist-deep in a pit, with one hand tied behind his back, armed only with a club. The woman, meanwhile, was free to move around the edge of the pit, armed with a weighted sack of stones. Both had rules. If the husband tried to climb out of the pit, he lost. If the wife fell in, she lost. Imagine the scene. A marriage turned into a battlefield, with the entire village watching like it was open-air theater. And sometimes, the duels were simply tragic. In one account, two best friends quarreled over inheritance rights. Instead of finding a compromise, they demanded trial by combat. These were men who had trained together, drunk together, and shared battlefields together. But once they stepped into the lists, friendship meant nothing. They fought viciously, neither holding back, until one lay dead in the dust. The survivor was declared innocent, but the guilt of killing his closest companion followed him for life. Medieval justice wasn't just harsh, it could tear lives apart in ways the sword alone couldn't mend. As the night settles deeper, imagine sitting in a medieval crowd, watching one of these duels unfold. The excitement, the fear, the shock. It wasn't just about two people fighting. It was about watching fate, God, and human pride collide right before your eyes. And for the fighters, it wasn't only about victory, it was about survival, honor, and, sometimes, the sheer absurdity of rules that decided life or death. One of the most dramatic royal duels took place in the early 14th century between Robert the Bruce of Scotland and Henry de Bohun, an English knight. It was the Battle of Bannockburn, 1314, a clash that would decide Scotland's independence. Now, normally, kings didn't ride into single combat, they had armies for that. But as the battle began, Bohun spotted Bruce riding a smaller horse out in front. Bohun lowered his lance and charged, convinced he was about to score the ultimate kill, ending the Scottish king with one blow. Imagine the silence of thousands watching, their breaths caught, as Bohun thundered forward. And then the last possible moment, Bruce sidestepped, rose in his saddle, and split Bohun's skull with his battle-axe. One strike, clean and final. The Scots roared with triumph. It wasn't just a duel, it was a symbol of defiance that echoed for centuries. Across the Channel in France, there was the legendary duel of Jean de Carouge and Jacques Le Gris in 1386. This one was so famous that it was retold in chronicles and even inspired a modern film. The two men, once allies, became bitter enemies after Le Gris was accused of raping Carouge's wife. With no clear evidence, King Charles VI allowed a judicial duel, the last officially sanctioned one in France. Thousands came to watch. Carouge, desperate for justice, fought with raw fury. In a brutal exchange, he managed to strike down Le Gris and kill him, proving his wife's word was true, at least, in the eyes of God and law. The duel became infamous not just for its violence, but for how it placed life and death judgment on a single clash of swords. But not all duels were fair or honorable. Some were political theater. Kings sometimes arranged champion fights, where two knights were chosen to fight on behalf of their rulers. The stakes were enormous. Imagine to men's lives, standing in for the pride of kingdoms. One wrong move could humiliate a monarch. In 1528, Francois de Vivan, a French knight, fought Guy Chabat de Yarnock in front of the king and court. Everyone thought Vivan would win easily, but Yarnock stunned the crowd with a clever strike to the back of Vivan's knee. That unexpected move became legendary, remembered as the coup de Yarnock, an expression that still survives in French today. And then there were duels that carried so much weight, they nearly changed Europe's political balance. In 1415, during the 100 Years' War, an English knight challenged a French noble to single combat before the full armies. The duel raged back and forth, both men showing incredible skill. Though no one died, the fight set the tone for the larger clash that followed, feeding the morale of entire nations. A single duel could become a spark in the powder keg of history. Of course, kings also knew the spectacle value. A duel wasn't just combat, it was entertainment, diplomacy, and propaganda rolled into one. Monarchs would parade their champions, dressing them in extravagant armor, polishing their swords until they gleamed, making sure everyone knew, this is the might of our realm. To the crowd, it wasn't just two men fighting. It was their whole nation's pride, clashing in steel. As you drift further into the story, think about the sheer drama of it. Kings holding their breath, thousands of soldiers pausing battle, and whole nations watching as fate balanced on the edge of a single blade. Medieval duels weren't only about survival, there were moments where history itself could pivot on one strike. Not every duel ended with one glorious strike or a dramatic cheer from the crowd. Some dragged on so long that both fighters collapsed from exhaustion. Chroniclers tell of knights who fought from dawn till dusk, hammering at each other in heavy armor, their swords dented, shields splintered, and their bodies soaked in sweat. By nightfall, neither could land the finishing blow. Judges sometimes had to call the duel a draw, which was embarrassing for both sides because, after all that effort, no one got justice. No one got honor, just bruises, broken ribs, and sore muscles. In other cases, both men died. One account from the Holy Roman Empire describes a bitter land dispute that led to trial by combat. The two knights entered the field, fought savagely, and delivered mortal wounds to each other within minutes. Both collapsed, bleeding out in front of the horrified crowd. The dispute was technically resolved, but with both claimants dead, the land went to the crown. Some might call that efficient, others just plain tragic. Sometimes the fights ended in ways so unexpected that they became legends. In one tale, a German knight challenged his rival in full armor. They fought brutally, swords sparking, until the challenger lost his balance. His opponent tried to finish him with a killing stroke, but the blade glanced off the armor, and the man accidentally stabbed himself in the leg. He bled out, while the fallen challenger scrambled back to his feet and claimed victory. Fate, it seemed, had a dark sense of humor. Then there were duels that never actually happened, yet caused massive drama. Imagine two nobles throwing down their gloves, swearing to meet on the field, and entire towns buzzing with excitement, only for one of them to skip out at the last minute. Failing to appear for a duel was basically social suicide. Chroniclers mocked cowards for generations, writing their names in shame. People remembered not the man's battles, but the duel he never showed up for. Sometimes not fighting was worse than losing. Another strange twist came when the rules of dueling were pushed to their limits. In certain regions, you could actually hire a champion to fight in your place. Picture a nobleman too old, too sick, or frankly too cowardly to swing a sword himself. Instead, he paid a professional fighter to represent him in the lists. This led to some wild mismatches, burly mercenaries crushing frail noble heirs, common soldiers suddenly deciding the fate of castles, even professional duelists who made careers out of fighting trial after trial. Justice, maybe not, but it made for fantastic theater. And let's not forget the duels, where weapons broke mid-fight. Chroniclers love telling stories of swords snapping in half, shields splintering, or even armor pieces falling off at the worst possible moment. One knight, left with nothing but the hilt of his sword, supposedly knocked out his opponent with it anyway, winning the duel with sheer stubbornness. Another resorted to fists and headbutts after his blade shattered, proving that sometimes brute force was the last resort. As you sink further into the calm of the night, imagine those fighters, exhausted, desperate, sometimes victorious, sometimes humiliated, sometimes both lying still on the ground, while the crowd gasped. These weren't just duels, they were slices of human unpredictability, where honor, fate, and chance twisted together in unforgettable ways. When you think of a medieval duel, you'd probably picture armored knights on horseback with shiny swords. But the truth is, trial by combat wasn't reserved for the rich. Ordinary villagers could find themselves called to fight too. If a farmer was accused of stealing, or a miller was accused of cheating customers, sometimes they didn't go to court, they went to the pit. A judge might say, "Let God decide," and suddenly two men in rough tunics, armed with wooden clubs or staves, would be whacking each other in front of their neighbors. Imagine a quiet farming community suddenly buzzing with the drama of a village duel. Chickens squawking, children watching wide-eyed, and everyone gossiping. Did you see how Olaf smashed Hans with that club? Justice and entertainment rolled into one. One of the strangest traditions, especially in parts of Germany, was the man versus woman duel. As bizarre as it sounds, law codes from the 13th and 14th centuries outlined exactly how it was supposed to work. If a wife accused her husband of terrible wrongdoing, or vice versa, they could settle it in a fight. To make things fair, the husband had to stand waist-deep in a pit, armed with a wooden club, while the wife was free to move around with a heavy sack filled with rocks. Rules stated that if he climbed out, he lost. If she fell in, she lost. The crowd of neighbors gathered, not sure whether to cheer, laugh, or pray. It was half courtroom, half slapstick theater, and yet this was considered legitimate justice. Then there were community duels, where two champions fought on behalf of towns or guilds. Let's say two cities were feuding over land rights. Instead of sending armies, they sometimes agreed to pick one fighter each. Those two men's lives carried the weight of entire populations. One fight, one winner, one city triumphant. The crowd's roar when their champion landed the final blow wasn't just pride in one man, it was civic victory. Imagine the pressure, the nerves, the crushing sense that thousands of people depended on your sword arm staying steady. In some places, even priests and monks were dragged into these fights, though technically the church forbade clergy from shedding blood. There's a story of a quarrel between two abbeys in the 12th century. Instead of debating theology, they appointed champions to fight for them. So while monks prayed inside their chapels, hired swords outside, settled the dispute with steel. You could say it was God and war working hand in hand. Though the irony didn't escape the chroniclers. Not all non-knightly duels were violent in the same sense. Some regions replaced trial by combat with ordeals that carried the same logic. Let God decide. You might have to carry a red-hot iron bar, walk across burning plowshares, or plunge your hand into boiling water. If your wounds healed quickly, you were innocent. If not, guilty. While not a duel in the traditional sense, it came from the same belief that divine will revealed itself through suffering. And just like duels, entire villages gathered to watch, half terrified, half thrilled, but there were moments when even peasants showed knightly flair. Chronicles tell of a blacksmith who was challenged to combat by a nobleman over a dispute. Instead of being cowed, the blacksmith fought fiercely, hammer in hand, and to everyone's shock, he won. The crowd went wild, common man defeating noble in a fight sanctioned by law. Stories like that spread like wildfire, becoming folktales that inspired others. Sometimes, duels were the only place where class lines blurred, if only for a few bloody minutes. As you sink deeper into the calm of the night, imagine those unlikely not kings, not knights, but farmers, wives, craftsmen, and even priests all stepping into the strange arena where justice, honor, and survival blurred into one. Their fights may not have been sung by troubadours, but they were just as raw, dramatic, and unforgettable. If there was one thing medieval people valued almost as much as life itself, it was reputation. An insult could be sharper than a blade, and once it was thrown, the only way to wipe it clean was with steel. Picture a noble banquet, goblets clinking, minstrels playing softly, and then someone mutters that you're a coward, or worse, that your family line isn't noble enough. Gasps echo across the hall. You rise, slam your hand on the table, and declare a duel. From that moment, the matter wasn't about who was right or wrong, it was about proving yourself with blood. Some of the most passionate duels sprang from this combustible mix of pride and rage. In Italy during the 15th century, city-states were full of fiery young nobles who would duel at the drop of a hat. Swords flashed, not just in fields or courts, but in back alleys, marketplaces, even cathedral steps. Chroniclers wrote of duels fought under moonlight, with friends watching nervously as steel clashed. Many of these weren't sanctioned by kings or judges. They were private affairs, born from wounded egos. But the stories spread, and the men who won basked in whispers of glory. And then there was revenge. Some feuds stretched across generations, with duels acting as both spark and flame. In one case in Burgundy, a nobleman was killed in a duel, and his son spent years waiting for the chance to challenge his father's killer. When the day finally came, the crowd gathered as if to watch destiny unfold. Father against son, memory against steel. It wasn't just a fight. It was the closing of a chapter written in blood. Revenge duels carried a weight heavier than honor. They were about restoring balance to the universe, one blade strike at a time. Yet not all duels were so serious. Sometimes they were fueled by sheer ego. A knight might boast too loudly in a tavern, claiming to be the best swordsman in the land. Someone else, fueled by ale and pride, would stand up and say, "Prove it." Before long, a crowd gathered outside, torches flickered, and the two men went at it. The duel might end quickly, with one man disarmed, or it might spiral into hours of clashing steel. Either way, the story would ripple outwards, carried by minstrels and gossip, turning into legend by the time it reached the next town. Some duels even turned into bizarre displays of stubbornness. Chroniclers described knights who kept fighting even after losing fingers, or staggering on after being blinded in one eye. One man, bleeding so badly that he could barely stand, still refused to yield. He shouted that his honor mattered more than his life, and with one final swing, he managed to cut down his opponent before collapsing himself. Both men died, but the crowd declared it a glorious double victory for pride, for stubbornness, for that medieval obsession with never backing down. And then there were duels of pure spectacle, staged less for justice and more for drama. A noble might ride into combat with golden spurs, silk banners fluttering, and even musicians playing. Imagine the ego it took to say, "I'll fight for my life, but only if it looks fabulous." Sometimes it worked style and skill hand in hand. Other times, that arrogance led to humiliating defeat, and when that happened, the story spread even faster. As you close your eyes and let the words drift over you, imagine those fights of passion. The heat of insult, the cold thirst for revenge, the burning glow of ego, all spilling into the lists with swords raised high. These duels weren't about kings or courts. They were about the fire in the human heart, and the lengths people would go to protect it. History remembers certain one-on-one battles, not just because they were violent, but because they turned men into legends or into cautionary tales. One of the most famous examples comes from England in 1387, when Sir James Douglas, known as the Black Douglas, earned his place in legend during countless clashes with the English. But one fight in particular stood out, a one-on-one encounter at Otterburn. He fought with such ferocity that even as he was fatally wounded, he kept urging his men forward. Though he didn't walk away from the duel alive, his courage burned so brightly that Scots sang songs about him for generations. Sometimes losing didn't destroy your reputation, it carved it into stone. On the flip side, humiliation could stain a knight forever. Chroniclers gleefully recorded the downfall of arrogant warriors who strutted into duels with confidence and swagger, only to be cut down quickly. One tale tells of a knight who challenged his rival in front of a royal audience, promising he would win within 3 strikes. He raised his sword, swung once, twice, and, on the 3rd strike, his rival countered and killed him on the spot. The audience gasped, then whispered, then roared with laughter. His promise of glory turned into a lifelong nickname mocking his foolish boast. Pride, as they say, came before the fall. Another duel that entered legend took place in 1467 in Burgundy, between the knight Anthony Woodville and the bastard of Burgundy, Philip of Savoy. It was staged as a grand tournament, but the one-on-one fight between the two men was the centerpiece. Chroniclers describe gleaming armor, cheering crowds, and the intense clash of steel. Neither man won a decisive victory, but both walked away with immense reputations for bravery and skill. In a way, the duel wasn't about killing, it was about showing the world that you were worthy of your name. Sometimes, legends were born from the strangest turns of fate. One story tells of a young knight mocked for being too small and weak. When challenged to a duel, everyone expected him to be slaughtered. Instead, he used speed and cunning, dodging blow after blow, until his rival exhausted himself. With a quick strike, the weakling knight won. His name became synonymous with cleverness triumphing over brute strength, and his tale was told in taverns for decades after. Of course, not every story ended so well. Some men were remembered precisely because their defeats were so spectacular. Chronicles loved to immortalize failure. One duel describes a knight so terrified that he dropped his sword before the first strike. His rival spared his life, but the story of his cowardice spread farther than any tale of victory. That was the cruel thing about medieval memory. A single moment could define you forever, for better or worse. And then there were duels that grew into legends simply because no one could agree on what really happened. Stories blurred, details changed, and soon the duel became half history, half myth. Was the knight truly outnumbered when he fought 3 men at once? Did he really kill his rival with a single perfect strike? No one knew, but in the telling and retelling, the duel became larger than life. And in the end, that was what mattered, not the truth, but the story. As you drift further into the calm of night, imagine the faces of those fighters, some shining with eternal glory, some shadowed by shame, some remembered only in half-true legends told by firelight. Their swords may be long gone, their armor rusted, but their duels live on, echoing through history. Imagine this: 2 men stepping into the lists, but before they even draw their swords, they kneel to pray. For many, a duel wasn't just a fight, it was seen as God's judgment. The outcome was believed to reveal divine will. If you won, it meant heaven itself had declared your innocence or righteousness. If you lost, well, it wasn't just your rival who beat you, it was God. This belief added a heavy, almost mystical weight to every clash of blades. It wasn't just survival, it was salvation on the line. Take, for example, the famous judicial duel in 1386 between Jean de Carouge and Jacques Legris in France. This wasn't just a brawl between angry men, it was a matter of truth and honor. Carouge accused Legris of a crime so grave that only combat could settle it. The 2 men fought in front of a massive crowd, including the French king himself. When Carouge finally struck down Legris, it wasn't only seen as his personal victory, it was taken as proof that his cause was just and his accusation true. The duel wasn't just history, it became a symbol of divine justice. Superstition also played its part. Many knights carried charms or relics sewn into their armor, little pieces of cloth blessed by priests or tiny crosses hidden under their tunics. Some believed these would protect them from blades, while others relied on whispered spells or folk magic. There were even stories of warriors rubbing herbs into their skin or drinking strange concoctions before a fight, convinced that it would give them strength or make them invincible. It sounds odd now, but when your life depended on surviving a single duel, who wouldn't cling to every scrap of luck they could find? And yet, despite all the ritual and reverence, duels could turn into moments of pure chaos. Chroniclers tell of fighters whose horses bolted before the first strike, or whose swords snapped in half during the opening clash. To the crowd, these were signs, omens that the gods or saints had already made their judgment. People gasped, crossed themselves, and whispered prayers as if they were witnessing a miracle unfolding right there, in the dirt. Then there was the matter of the duel's aftermath. Victory often brought celebration, feasts, and songs sung in your honor, but defeat, especially in a judicial duel, didn't just end with death. Sometimes the loser's body was humiliated, dragged, displayed, or buried without honor because his loss proved his guilt in the eyes of society. Victory could sanctify a man, defeat could erase his name. But here's the twist. Not every duel was truly about God's will. Behind the scenes, politics, wealth, and manipulation often played just as big a role. A wealthy noble might secretly bribe the judges overseeing the duel, or prepare the lists in his favor. A skilled fighter might be chosen as a champion to fight in someone else's place, turning the supposed judgment of God into more of a high-stakes performance. Still, for the common people watching, every duel carried that aura of fate. It was thrilling, terrifying, and sacred all at once. A duel was never just two men fighting. It was a spectacle where heaven, earth, and human pride all collided. As you drift further, picture a torchlit field at night, banners fluttering in the wind, the crowd hushed in anticipation. Two figures step forward, each carrying not only their weapons, but their faith, their fears, and their reputations. And with the clash of their blades, all of its belief, honor, and destiny hangs in the balance. You see, medieval duels weren't always exclusive to nobles. Sometimes the courts demanded trial by combat even for common folk. Imagine being a peasant farmer, one day tending your sheep, and the next day dragged into a field, told to prove your innocence with a cudgel or a club. It sounds absurd, but records show it happened. And in those fights, the weapons were often as rough as the fighters themselves. Sticks, shields, or even farming tools pressed into the service of law. One of the most bizarre examples comes from 13th century Germany, where judicial duels occasionally involved women, and because the law loved its sense of fairness, rules were adjusted in peculiar ways. If a woman fought a man, she was sometimes allowed to use a stone wrapped in cloth, while the man had to stand in a waist-high pit, with one arm tied behind his back. Picture it, a man hopping awkwardly in a hole, trying not to get his head bashed in by an angry woman wielding her weighted cloth like a medieval flail. Chroniclers tell us that in some cases, the woman actually won. It wasn't common, but it certainly made for a story worth retelling in every tavern. Clerics, too, occasionally found themselves in strange duels. Despite church law officially forbidding priests and monks from shedding blood, disputes over land or honor sometimes pushed them into combat. Some hired champions to fight in their place, but others couldn't resist taking up arms themselves. One tale tells of a bishop who dueled in secret, claiming it wasn't really bloodshed if it was God's will. The blurred line between sacred law and violent reality gave these duels a surreal edge. And then there were the champions, men who made a living by fighting in place of others. These were professionals, hardened by countless battles. If you were wealthy enough to hire one, you could send him into the duel carrying your honor on his shoulders. Imagine being a small-town baker accused of cheating someone, but instead of swinging a stick yourself, you pay a scarred, grizzled mercenary to do it for you. If he wins, you're innocent. If he loses, well, maybe baking bread would have been easier after all. Some duels even blurred the line between combat and theater. In certain towns, judicial fights became public spectacles, with markets, musicians, and food stalls springing up around the event. It was less like a grim trial and more like a carnival, where the fate of the fighters was just another form of entertainment. Children cheered, merchants sold hot pies, and gamblers whispered wagers, as though someone's honor and maybe life wasn't hanging by a thread in the middle of the field. But behind the spectacle, the stakes were painfully real. For peasants, defeat could mean death, but even victory could leave scars that lasted a lifetime. For women, winning a duel might restore their reputation. but it also risked marking them as dangerous or unnatural. For clerics, the stain of fighting could haunt their souls, even if their bodies survived. And yet, these duels happened, leaving behind fragments of stories that show how complex and strange medieval justice really was. As you drift further into this bedtime journey, imagine not knights in gleaming armor, but everyday folk, mud on their boots, sweat on their brows, thrust into battles they never asked for. Their weapons were crude, their courage tested, and their names mostly forgotten. But for one brief moment, they too stood in the lists, facing judgment with nothing but their own hands and hearts. If there's one thing history proves, it's that human hearts can start wars just as quickly as kings. And in the Middle Ages, when your reputation was worth more than gold, a careless insult or a stolen kiss could set swords clashing. Take, for example, the countless duels fought over accusations of adultery. Imagine a nobleman suspecting another knight of having too much interest in his wife. There weren't DNA tests, there weren't detectives, there was only the duel. Two men would square off, sometimes in secret fields, sometimes in full view of lords and ladies, to prove who was lying and who spoke the truth. It wasn't about evidence, it was about who could still stand when the dust settled. And for the women caught in the middle, the outcome could change their lives forever. If the husband won, she might be vindicated or condemned, depending on what he claimed. If the rival won, she might suddenly find herself tied to a new protector. Love was rarely gentle in these stories. It was as sharp as the swords they carried. Then there were duels sparked by pure insult. Medieval knights were incredibly sensitive about honor. Call a man a coward, or mock his lineage, and you might wake up the next morning with a formal challenge waiting at your door. Sometimes these fights were almost theatrical, full of speeches, grand gestures, and over-the-top vows. Other times they were brutal and short, with reputations and, sometimes, heads rolling in the dirt. Chroniclers often wrote these tales with a touch of humor, as if they too saw the absurdity of two men risking everything over a rude word, muttered after too much wine. And of course, the courtly love culture of the Middle Ages added more fuel to the fire. Knights swore oaths to ladies, vowing to defend their honor at all costs. It sounds poetic, but it often meant real bloodshed. A whispered rumor about a lady's virtue could lead to two armored men hacking each other apart, just to prove who was her true champion. Sometimes the woman herself had no say in the matter. She simply watched, terrified, as men killed and died in her name. One legendary example comes from Spain, where two knights fought for the love of a lady, dueling for hours until both collapsed from exhaustion. Neither truly won, but their devotion became the stuff of poetry. Their fight was remembered not for victory, but for the sheer madness of risking everything for romance. But love-fueled duels didn't only happen among nobles. Even common folk sometimes found themselves swept into deadly drama. Imagine two blacksmiths competing for the affection of the same woman. In a village square, with neighbors watching, they might raise their hammers, not over an anvil, but over each other's heads. And while chroniclers rarely bothered recording the names of peasants, the tales lingered in oral traditions, half folklore, half warning. There was also the darker side, forced duels, where women accused of infidelity were made to fight to prove their innocence. Armed with crude weapons, they faced the impossible choice of battle or condemnation. These stories remind us that the romance of medieval dueling was often more nightmare than fairy tale. As you drift deeper into this bedtime story, picture a moonlit courtyard, torches flickering, and two figures circling each other, not for kings or crowns, but for matters of the heart. Their blades gleam, their pride burns, and in the silent breath before the clash, you can almost hear it, the heartbeat of love, pounding like a war drum. Picture a field transformed into an arena, banners fluttering, nobles gathering under brightly colored pavilions, and common folk crowding at the edges. These weren't quiet affairs, these were staged duels, almost like medieval pay-per-view events, where the thrill of combat blended with the pomp of theater. Kings and queens loved them. For rulers, hosting a grand duel wasn't only entertainment, it was politics. It showed off their wealth, their sense of justice, and their ability to bring warriors from far and wide to compete under their gaze. Chroniclers describe elaborate lists being built, wooden barriers to define the fighting ground, stands for spectators, even decorated tents where fighters prepared like actors before a play. The duel between Anthony Woodville of England and the Bastard of Burgundy in 1467 is one of the most famous examples. This wasn't just a fight, it was international diplomacy played out with lances and swords. The two men faced each other before huge audiences, with foreign dignitaries watching. Chroniclers say that armor gleamed like mirrors in the sun. The clash of steel echoed like thunder, and every strike sent waves of gasps and cheers through the crowd. Neither man was decisively defeated, but both walked away with their reputations glowing brighter than before. Victory didn't always matter, appearance did. These spectacles weren't limited to nobles either. Towns sometimes staged duels during fairs or festivals, turning them into part of the holiday. Imagine strolling through a market filled with roasted meats, jugglers and musicians, only to hear the roar of a crowd gathering around two men preparing to fight. Children perched on their parents' shoulders, vendors shouted out last-minute wagers, and everyone held their breath as the fighters stepped forward. But while these events were theatrical, they weren't bloodless. Armor could crack, bones could break, and men sometimes died in front of audiences who had come hoping for a show. The strange thing is, the danger made it all the more exciting. It wasn't just staged theater, it was theater where the outcome could mean death. That edge of reality gave medieval spectacles their power. Sometimes, the church tried to rein them in, declaring that such duels were too violent, too worldly, too far from God's law. But the people loved them too much to give them up, and so, even as bishops preached against them, lords kept hosting them, and crowds kept flocking to watch. And let's not forget the pageantry. Fighters often dressed in colors representing their houses, with elaborate plumes on their helmets and coats of arms painted on their shields. Trumpets blared before the first clash, heralds shouted out names and titles, and for a moment it felt less like a fight to the death and more like a parade of courage. Medieval audiences wanted both blood and beauty, and duels gave them both. As you drift deeper into the night, imagine sitting in those stands, a soft breeze carrying the scent of hay and roasting meat, the sun glinting off polished steel. The crowd is hushed, the trumpets sound, and two knights lower their visors. Whatever the outcome, the memory of that clash will echo long after the dust has settled. You see, in the medieval world, a single duel could sometimes carry the weight of nations. These weren't just brawls between hot-headed knights. They were carefully staged confrontations whose outcomes could ripple outward, affecting armies, treaties, and dynasties. One of the clearest examples comes from the 100 Years' War, that long struggle between England and France. In 1387, a Scottish knight named James Douglas, famous for his ferocity, met the English in a fight that was remembered as much for his one-on-one dueling as for the larger battle. Chroniclers describe him singling out rival commanders, fighting as though the war itself hinged on his personal courage, and in a sense, it did. His reputation and the morale he inspired in his men shaped how his side fought. When Douglas fell, his loss demoralized his forces, altering the course of the clash. His duel became a turning point, proof that sometimes the fate of hundreds could be tied to the courage or death of a single man. Then there were duels that acted as substitutes for entire battles. Sometimes two commanders, desperate to avoid bloodshed or unwilling to risk their armies, agreed to let champions decide the outcome. It sounds almost unbelievable. Two men fighting while thousands of soldiers stood watching, their swords carrying the weight of victory or defeat for everyone. Chroniclers loved to describe these moments as if they were divine theater, God sparing the masses by channeling war into a single clash. Of course, not all rulers were so noble. Some used duels as excuses, staging them as political theater to justify war. Imagine a king arranging a duel between his knight and an enemy's champion, then claiming that the result, win or lose, proved his divine right to invade, rule, or demand tribute. These duels weren't just contests of skill, they were propaganda, weapons in the arsenal of politics. The duel between Jean de Carouge and Jock le Gris, in 1386, famous for being the last judicial duel sanctioned in France, also had enormous political ripples. Though it was a trial by combat to settle a personal accusation, its outcome was watched by the entire court and interpreted as divine proof of truth. When Carouge killed le Gris, it didn't just settle a feud, it reaffirmed the king's authority to use God's justice as a political tool. The duel was remembered for centuries, shaping not only legal traditions but the very perception of honor and authority in France. Even outside Europe, similar ideas shaped politics. In Eastern Europe, steppe cultures often sent champions into duels before armies clashed, believing that a single combat could weaken or terrify the enemy. These weren't just preliminaries, they were morale weapons. If your champion won, your army felt invincible. If he lost, dread spread through the ranks before the battle even began. Think of the weight on those fighters. It wasn't only their pride at stake, but the pride of nations. Thousands of lives, acres of land, and the honor of kings could hang on a single stroke of the sword. No wonder these duels became legends. Chroniclers embroidered them, poets immortalized them, and even centuries later, they still glow with that strange mix of theater, faith, and destiny. As you sink further into the stillness of night, picture two armies camped on opposite hills, banners snapping in the wind. Between them, in the lonely silence of an open field, two figures step forward. Every eye is fixed on them. Every hope, every fear, every future rests on their blades. The world pauses for their clash and history bends to its outcome. You see, in the Middle Ages, a duel didn't end when one man lay in the dirt. The real battle began afterward, in how the story was told, sung, and remembered. Victory or defeat could define a family for centuries. Sometimes, even the smallest fight was magnified into legend, while great victories could fade if no bard cared enough to sing about them. For the victors, the aftermath was often glorious. Chroniclers described them in glowing terms, comparing their strikes to lightning and their courage to lions. Troubadours picked up their names, weaving them into ballads that spread from castle halls to village taverns. A single triumph could transform a minor knight into a household name. Imagine being a farmer's child, hearing a traveling singer recount how Sir So-and-so struck down his rival with one perfect blow, and dreaming of carrying a sword yourself someday. Duels weren't just moments in history, they were seeds planted in the imagination of a generation. For the defeated, however, the consequences were grim. Their families often bore the shame, whispered about for decades. Did you hear? His grandfather was the one who lost the duel at such and such field. Defeat clung like a shadow, staining reputations even beyond death. In judicial duels especially, losing was more than personal, it was a divine condemnation, proof in the eyes of the people that you were guilty. Even if the truth was murkier, the story hardened into certainty. Sometimes, the legends twisted over time. A fighter who had been clumsy or cowardly might, generations later, be remembered as noble but unlucky. A victor's tale might grow exaggerated. First he defeated one man, then 3, then 10, until his single duel became a full-blown epic. Medieval memory was slippery, shaped by pride, politics, and the need for good storytelling. And then there were the relics. Swords, pieces of armor, even the blood-stained earth of the dueling ground were sometimes preserved as sacred tokens. A knight's family might display his broken weapon as proof of his sacrifice, or a church might keep a relic from a duel fought in the name of justice. These objects tied memory to the physical world, making the duels echo tangible. The fascinating part is how ordinary people absorbed these stories. Not everyone could read the chronicles, but they could listen. Around hearths and in taverns, stories of duels were retold like ghost tales, passed from mouth to mouth, reshaped with each telling. A small village duel might swell into a legendary saga by the time it reached another region. This oral tradition blurred fact and fiction, but it kept the spirit of dueling alive long after the actual fighters had turned to dust. And yet, beneath all the bravado and romance, there was a darker undercurrent. The aftermath of duels often left widows, orphans, and families ruined. The songs rarely told of the grief, the debts, or the bitterness left behind. The crowd remembered the clash of steel, but the quiet suffering afterward was forgotten. History, after all, prefers heroes to widows. Still, in every song, every whispered tale, every relic preserved, medieval duels lived on. They became more than fights. They became lessons of courage, of folly, of honor, of pride. They reminded people that a single moment, a single strike, could echo longer than a lifetime. As you drift further into this night, imagine sitting in a firelit hall, the scent of smoke curling upward, as an old bard strums his lute and tells the tale of a duel fought long ago. The faces around you lean in, eyes wide, hearts stirred. The duel may be over, but in that moment, it lives again, its echo carried forward, reshaped for yet another generation. For hours now, we've wandered through lists and fields, stood in torchlit arenas, and watched men and women alike stake everything on a single clash of steel. We've seen duels fought for honor, for justice, for love, for politics, and sometimes simply for pride. And as the centuries rolled on, each fight, whether glorious, humiliating, or tragic, wove itself into the larger tapestry of history. What is it that makes these duels so fascinating? Perhaps it's their simplicity. In an age of massive armies and sprawling wars, the idea that two people could decide everything with their own hands carried a kind of purity. No strategies, no supply lines, no endless battles, just one body against another, courage against fear, skill against chance. To medieval minds, it was more than combat. It was destiny revealed in the space of a heartbeat. And maybe, in some strange way, that's why their stories still echo with us today. Because deep down, we recognize the humanity in them. The pride that leads someone to risk everything over an insult. The devotion that pushes a knight to fight in the name of love. The fear of judgment that forces a peasant into a duel to defend his life. These emotions, love, fear, pride, faith, are timeless. They belong not just to the medieval world, but to us as well. Of course, we also can't ignore the darker side. Duels left scars, widows, and children without fathers. They were spectacles that often entertained crowds while destroying lives. The romance and poetry that chroniclers loved to write about hid the pain and cruelty underneath. And yet, human memory clings to the drama, the spectacle, the clash of swords in the quiet of dawn. As the centuries passed, duels faded. Courts moved away from trial by combat. Armies grew too large for personal champions to decide wars, and the world began to frown upon the idea of bloodshed as justice. But the stories remained. In songs, in plays, in books, in whispered legends, the spirit of medieval one-on-one fights lived on. And tonight, we've breathed life into them once more, just as those old storytellers once did, by Firelight. So, as we close this long tale, let your mind drift one last time to a medieval field. The air is cool, the crowd is hushed, and two figures stand across from one another. The silence before the clash stretches out like eternity. For a moment, the world holds its breath. Then the swords meet, steel ringing out like a bell. Whatever the outcome, the story will live far beyond this moment, carried through time, remembered in awe, in fear, and in wonder. And now, as the echoes of those duels fade into the soft quiet of the night, let your own thoughts grow still. The swords are laid down, the fields are empty, the crowds have gone home. All that remains is the calm silence of history, wrapping you like a blanket. The fights are over, the stories are told, and you, too, can rest. Good night.